Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, What's New in Forecast Pro TRAC version 4. My name is James Berry. I am the Director of Training here at Business Forecast Systems. Been with the company now 12 years, and I'll be the one guiding you through the new features in TRAC version 4, as well as upgrading from TRAC version 3 into TRAC version 4. So in this webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a couple of the basics. We're going to start by discussing how we actually upgrade from TRAC version 3 into version 4. We'll look at our new feature, which is our data manager, as well as some new allocations for how we distribute forecasts throughout the hierarchy. We'll then move and talk about the forecast override grid. We've added some new and exciting features here, including the ability to display past forecasts. So we can load in your archive forecast into the grid, which can be used for reference or for building formulas. And we have a whole new scheme for rounding data, which can be utilized especially for low volume data. So how is it that we actually round into whole numbers? So we have new features available there as well. And then finally, we've improved some of the modeling. We've added a new custom component model. We've improved upon our forecasting by analogy, which will help us with new product forecasting. And we've improved the exponential smoothing methodologies to include this new constant level modeling. So lots of nice new features that are available there, and we're going to walk through all of these one at a time. Okay? We're going to start by actually upgrading from TRAC version 3 to version 4. Most of you are current Forecast Pro TRAC users, and so you want to sort of walk through the steps of how am I going to upgrade my current projects from version 3 into version 4. And I can tell you that actually these steps are very, very easy, and it's very direct to do this. What we're going to do is we're going to simply save and close our project in version 3, so we're going to have a version 3 project. We're going to open it up in TRAC version 4. We're going to check to make sure everything populated correctly, which it should do automatically for us, and then we're simply going to do a save as to save this into a version 4 project. I do recommend as a best practice to save your version 4 project with a new name, because once you save in version 4, you can't go back to version 3. So just as a best practice, if we're going to upgrade these projects, you should probably maintain a copy of your version 3 project just to make sure it works. So let's go ahead and walk through this with an example. So here I have our good old bakery example. I have it loaded in TRAC version 3. You can see I have a bunch of overrides. I have my conversions are available to me. I've put on some modifiers to my data, and I've given it a name to call this my version 3 project. So I've gone ahead and I'm going to go ahead and save this project here in version 3, and I'm going to close version 3. And what I'm then going to do is I'm going to open up version 4. So here's TRAC version 4. The easiest way to distinguish between it is you can tell that the script icon has changed. It's been replaced with our new data manager icon. That's the easiest way to see the difference between version 3 and version 4. Now in order to make this work, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say File Open, and I'm going to open up my version 3 project that I was just working on. So I'm going to go ahead and say Open, and what it'll do is it will open up here in TRAC version 4. It's going to make all the conversions necessary, and then everything will open exactly the same. You can see that my modifiers were still restored, my overrides were restored, my external and data would have been restored, and my conversions were restored. And so all of this has happened all at the same time. And all I would need to do to convert it is to simply go and say File, Save As, and I'm going to give this a new name. I'm going to call this Bakery version 4 so that I have my own copy of this. This way I have a version 3 copy and a version 4 copy. As I said, that's not required, but it's something that I would highly recommend in terms of a best practice, is to make sure that I have a version 3 project and a version 4 project. Because again, now that I've saved this in version 4, I can no longer open this project in version 3. So keeping a version 3 copy and a version 4 copy is what I highly recommend. Now let's go ahead and walk through some of the differences between the programs. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go up to the Settings menu and we'll go to the Options dialog box. I do want to point out that all of these changes that we're looking at are included in the slide deck. The slide deck will be available to download as well as this recorded webinar, so you'll be able to walk through these together. A couple of the key changes you'll notice here in the Basic tab, we no longer have a data mode dropdown. This has been removed. We no longer need this. The data manager will handle this. And we'll take a look at the data manager in just a few moments. On the Formats tab, one of the things you can see is we've added this new option to automatically sort your data. So in version 3, you have to pre-sort your input historical data, whether it's coming from Excel, a text file, or via ODBC. And we still recommend you do that as a best practice. However, we've added this new option to automatically sort your data now as it comes in. So no matter what format you have, Forecast Pro can automatically sort it. This will help avoid any sort of data errors that may have been occurring when you pull data. Can also help with other sources if I'm using multiple data files. So lots of usefulness here. You may want to just turn this on by default just to make sure that your data is always going to work the way you want it to. And then finally over here in the advanced controls, we have this new option. So we will discuss later on in this webinar the constant level exponential smoothing model, which we've added. We think it adds a lot of value and it really can improve your forecast accuracy. However, you will notice that from switching from version 3 to version 4, your forecast may have changed because we are now using this exponential smoothing model in our expert selection, and it'll be chosen in various places, and this is going to cause your total forecast to possibly change. And so if you don't want to use this new feature, you can turn it off. Although I highly recommend against it, we think that this is really adding some great value and really will help improve your forecast accuracy. Okay? So in addition to the settings, the other thing you'll notice that's different in version 4 is our new data manager. This is replacing our script. I'll go ahead and click on this. And what you will see is we've now gotten rid of just a single script that was referencing the historical data file and basically added a place where we can see all of the optional data files that you can bring in addition to the history. So this top row is where we'll see our historical data file, and you can see my bakery data has been listed here. This is required. The top row is required. However, all these other ones are optional. And we'll go ahead and take a look in our slides at some of our new data. So here are all our external data files. The first thing you'll notice is that there is no longer a secondary file. We have broken up the information from the secondary file into their own separate files. So in version 3, your secondary file could contain filters, it could contain conversions, it could contain any kind of exception report thresholds and things like that, and they all had to be shoehorned into a single file, and they all had to be in there. What we've done is we've broken them into their own files, so now the filters and the conversions get their own files. And you're not limited to a single file, you could have multiple files. So we think that this is a good expansion of our data, and so it allows you to have more flexibility when bringing in filters and conversions. Now, when you upgrade from version 3 to version 4, notice in the data manager, the conversions, filters, and the definitions are defined with your secondary file. So the secondary file is repeated for all of these because in the old version, you would have a single file that would contain your conversions and your filters and your definitions. And so it'll be pre-populated here for all of these. And so this will work. You'll want to check to make sure that this did happen, and it'll pull all of your information in here. So we'll be able to see this as well. Okay. A couple other things about the data manager. From this point going forward, if I ever wanted to add new data, any of this other external data that we've been allowing from before, we can simply come in and from our drop-down, we would say add, and we would choose the data file that we would want to utilize, so whether it's Excel, a text file, or via ODBC. So if I were to add an external data file to this project, I would choose Excel, and what I will see is I'll come over here to my bakery, and I could have my external data file. It gets added to this list. So in this drop-down, it will manage all the different files of the different types. So I currently have a single file in here, but if I had multiple external data files or multiple conversion files, they would all be listed in these drop-downs. It also remembers the path. You can see here it's showing the path that it's remembering that, so I can have that. If I ever wanted to stop using them, I can use the remove drop-down to remove any of my data files from here. You'll also see this new column that will basically keep track of how we're synchronizing our data. So currently you can see these files are up to date and current, whereas I just added my external data file and it's requiring a refresh. And you can see here we have these refresh buttons. We've also broken this out. It used to be in the old version, in version 3, if you ever wanted to add any external data, it would require us to refresh everything. You'd have to reread your history, you'd have to reforecast and re-import all of your data by hand. We've simplified this, And now you can pinpoint and individually refresh individual parts. So if I were to hit refresh here, it would come in and refresh my data and load it in. And now it would say it's up to date. So I've refreshed just this single file and I've synchronized everything. So I can now have this one-stop shop where I can see, are all my files up to date? Are they all being utilized correctly? We've also added this button here. It says read and forecast. This is the equivalent to hitting the second and the third red icon to read and forecast all at once. You can still use the red icons individually, but this is sort of giving us a shortcut. You'll also notice these groups of external items says this checkbox that says on read. What this indicates is that when I read my history, if these checkboxes are checked, I will also go out and reread these data files at the same time. So I can pick and choose, do I want these items to be refreshed when I reread my history or not? So I have this ability to set all of these. So we really feel that the data manager is allowing us to have a single one-stop shop to manage all of our different data files that are flowing around. And we think that this will be easier to maintain. We can see if everything's up to date. We can have multiples of each of these files. We can add and remove them much more easily. So we feel this gives a lot more visibility and it is a much better way for us to manage our data going forward. Okay, I'm going to close out of here and close this project. And again, we also have added some new pieces here. You'll see these two new external files, custom allocation and integer rounding. These will allow us to bring in new information. The custom allocation will help us use, in addition to bottom up and top down, for deciding how our forecasts are distributed in our hierarchy. We can now customize this. The integer rounding has to do with our new override features for showing whole number rounding, and we'll look at this shortly as well. Let's look at these one at a time. I'm going to start with the custom allocation. Okay. So in TRAC version 3, we can do bottom up or top-down aggregation. We've seen this before, and this is what's been built into TRAC version 3, and it's been in Forecast Pro basically since the beginning. What we've added is this new third option, what we call custom allocation. This is where the user can come in and say, I want to say what proportions are used to break down my data. So if we look at our simple example of a group with two items in it, we had our bottom-up forecast where we would forecast the two end items and we would add them up to become the group total. We had our top-down forecast, which is we would forecast at the group and we proportionally distribute based off of the initial statistical forecasts. With our custom allocation, we are also going to forecast at this group total, and we're going to lock it, and then you are going to provide how I actually distribute to the items underneath it. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and show you an example of this. Here's a bakery data set. Now in order to bring in my custom allocation, I'm going to go to my data manager. And this is going to be used in our definitions file. So I'm going to go over here to definitions and I'm going to add. And I'm going to come down here and I've called this call for custom allocation. I'll go ahead and open it. And again, in order to update this, I need to hit refresh to make sure it's in sync. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and exit. I'm going to look here at SIDS Club. Now, if I went, SIDS Club currently is bottom up because we have no other modifier on it. So this forecast is just the addition of these 5 forecasts of the items underneath it. My alternative, which I could have used in version 3, would be to go top down. I can right click and say top down. You'll see it'll change the forecast and I will proportionally distribute that forecast based off the initial statistical forecasts. My new option is for me to set it. So instead of going top down, what I will do is use this new custom allocation. It'll put on a \call. You'll see the forecast will be the same as if I had gone top down. But what I've done is I've actually loaded and said, give 25% of the volume to each of these items. So you'll see the shape is exactly the same, and it's all of the volumes are exactly the same. This is 4,300. This one's 4,300. This one's 4,300. And this final item is 4,300 because I said give this each 25%. So I was able to come in and set it. If I were to come in here and put a call at Stuff Mart, I've set different proportions to the different items so that they'll get different proportions. So I bring this in from an external data file and I set the proportionality. So I could do something evenly where each of these get even amounts or they get different amounts based off of what I want to set it to. So this gives me much more flexibility to bring in my distribution of my different items. Okay, we'll go ahead and close this example. Now the other place where we've improved and added new features is in the overrides. In our override grid, what we have added is this new system row dialog box. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Okay, so here are some overrides of my different items. And what you can see is if I right-click on the override, just like I would in version 3, I have an override design dialog box, and I can bring that up. What we've added is this new button down here for our system rows. And this brings up our system row design dialog box. We actually have two new features that we've added here, two new types of system rows. The first is that we allow you to load in previous forecasts into the override grid itself. And I can choose the statistical, the baseline, or the final. I'll go ahead and choose the final. And I have 6 months worth of archived forecasts, and I can show, for instance, 1 month and 2 months ago. I'll go ahead and say OK. And what this will do is it will turn on my new system rows. You can see it says previous origin 1, previous origin 2. And I'll say OK. And it will load in my forecasts for the last 2 months. Here's my forecast from last month. Here's my forecast from 2 months ago. And I can see these, I can visualize them, I can use them for calculations, and I can utilize this information for my different data. Okay. What else have we added? I'm going to turn these rows off. Back to the system row. I've also added this integer forecast. This is a new type of rounding that we allow you to do. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the final, and you can see the default rounding quantity is 1. And what this will do is it'll be a new system row. I'm going to turn it on here as my integer forecast. And it's a new type of rounding. It's what we call an accumulative rounding. What this means is that instead of using a scientific rounding, so if I turn this back to our scientific rounding, basically everything would round to 0 because it's 0.5 or above, it rounds up. And you can see that the forecast is 0.44 a month. And so these would all show up as zeros. With the integer rounding, what we can do is we can accumulate the data. So right now, if we see this, this is 0.4, but the 2-month total is 0.89, and that would round up to 1. Cumulative total here is 1.3, so this would round to 0. The cumulative total is 1.78, that would round up to 2. So now I have a 1 here and a 1 here. That now sums to 2. And if we show over the 12 months, this adds up to 5.3. This rounds to 5. So the cumulative total is the same as taking the sum and rounding it up or down using scientific rounding. But instead of getting a flat line forecast, what I'll get is if I actually go ahead and turn on, I'll go ahead and turn this on in the graph to see both. We now have a step forecast of 0s and 1s, which is much more useful for our data. Now, if I look at another example where it would have rounded up, this would have rounded to 1 every month because it's 0.65. 0.65 would round to 1. So I can show you here if we had our normal rounding, it would round to 1 every month. But using, again, our cumulative rounding, I'll go ahead and set this precision back to 2. What we can see is it's rounding up. So this would round to, we keep rounding up here, this would have rounded to 7.8, which would round to 8. And I have 0s and 1s rounding up with my accumulation. For low volume data, this can be very, very useful. It'll allow us to have zeros or whole fixed numbers. Now, another thing that we can do with this data is here in the design dialog box, we actually have the ability to set the rounding quantity. So everything is defaulting to rounding to 1, to the next whole number. And we can choose whether it rounds up, rounds down, or does a scientific rounding. However, one of the other features that we can bring in is what we call an integer rounding quantity. Using our data manager, this is another one of these definition files, I can come over here and load in this integer rounding quantity, where I can set the number that I want it to round to. In this case, I want it to round to 2. So it will round to 2. Instead of rounding to 1, it will round to 2, because that's going to be what I'm going to sell in whole units. For this item here, it still rounds to 1. If we look at some of these other ones, this is set to round to 35. So it accumulates and accumulates and accumulates until it would round up to 35, and then it would have a spike. And again, I can choose using my new whether it rounds up or rounds down. So this will round down, or I can round up, which is as soon as I have any value in my data, it'll round up to here. So I can utilize this information and I can load in my own individual item by item level of how I'm going to round this data. So this can be very, very useful if I'm using an low volume data sets and I have lots of low volume and sporadic items. Instead of getting flat lines, I can now set this information if I want to. Okay, so we'll close this example and we'll move on. Now we're going to switch gears. So these are some new features that we've put in, okay? We just saw our new custom allocation. We saw our rounding quantities. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the new modeling information that we have in Forecast Pro. And we're going to start with the constant level of smoothing. What this will do is it's going to basically say, I want to set the smoothing weight for the level to a very, very small number. And for items that are seasonal but sporadic, this can be very, very helpful. So let's go ahead and look at an example of this. So what you can see here is an item that's very seasonal, but has very low volumes on this when it's not being sold. And the old version of Forecast Pro, version 3, had difficult time dealing with this type of data. See, the smoothing models have a really hard time getting to 0, and it could sometimes artificially inflate these low periods of time. And so what a constant level model will do, you'll see it'll show up in the forecast report as an NaCl. What that says is a non-trended seasonal model where we're using additive seasonality. And you can see it sets the smoothing weight for the level to be very, very low, which will allow the volume to get very small. And what it will also do is we'll force an additive seasonal model. So basically the forecast will be 0 in between, and then on these seasonal points we'll have these spikes. We can see another example of it here. It's not quite 0 in between, but it's still very low volume in between the high peak seasons, and it fits it here as well. We have found through testing that these constant level models really can improve the accuracy of your forecast when you have data like this, and you'll see it popping up throughout the program using the expert selection model. So we think that this is actually a really great improvement into forecast accuracy, and we think that this is really going to help a lot of folks with a lot of types of data. However, the reason we want to point this out is if you switch from version 3 to version 4 and this is turned on, obviously your aggregate forecast will probably change. So moving from one month to the next, you may have changes in your forecast because it might use these new models. And so it's something to be aware of as you move, and as we said, if you want to go back to not using this, under our advanced controls, we can turn this new feature off. Although I highly recommend against it, we think that this actually is a great step forward in terms of accuracy improvement, and so I highly recommend you let it work, and we think it really will improve forecast accuracy across the board. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this example, and we'll move on to another piece of added modeling functionality, which is the component model. Okay, a component model will allow you to set the final values from smoothing models for the level, the trend, the seasonality, and for events. We think this is going to be a really, really great way for you to come in and customize your forecasts much more effectively. So let's see some examples of this. So here's an item. You can see it picked an exponential smoothing model. It had a trend. It has seasonality to it. Okay, and Forecast Pro picked that. However, what if I wanted to customize this? You know, right now in version 3, you could customize the smoothing weights, but it's a very sort of inefficient way of trying to set certain values. But what if I could come in and change the values themselves? What if I could change the value of the level? What if I could change the value of the trend? Or even set the seasonality myself? That's what the component model allows you. So in order to utilize this, what we're going to do is we're going to right-click, say Model, Component. This is our new component model that we have available to us. Go ahead and choose this, and it brings up our component dialog box. And what you can see is it picked from our smoothing model the level, the trend, and the seasonal indexes. But now what I'm able to do is actually change any of these. So for example, if I wanted to do a custom level, I could. Right now the average per month is 650, but what if I set this to 800? Okay. I can go ahead and commit this, and you'll see it will shift my data up at this new starting point. So I've been able to raise the level up or down to where it starts. Or I could set it back to automatic, and Forecast Pro will pick it what it thinks is best. Right now I picked a linear trend, which I could do, but I could also come in here and customize the trend. So right now I'm growing at about 6 units per month. But if I want to decrease this, what if I wanted to grow at 8 units a month? And you'll see it'll raise the trend. Or what if I wanted to grow at 20 units a month? And I'll go ahead and commit this, and it will grow at a much faster rate. And I can control this rate of growth if I wanted to. I also have other ways of setting the trend. I could set the endpoint. Right now it ends at 900. Well, what if I need to finish 12 months from now at, say, 750? And what it will do is it'll make sure your forecast ends up here, and it will recalculate the slope. Or what if I need my total forecast to add up to 9,000? And it will go ahead and figure out the growth rate for that to happen. So I can set these in a number of different ways. In addition to a linear trend, I can also do a bent trend. And so if I do a bent trend, what I can do is I can set the growth rate, but also where it ends up. So for instance, 100% is just a straight line, but if I set this to, say, 40%, what it will do is it will start off linear, but then it will bend it down for me. So I can do that. Or if I want this to grow even faster, I could set this at 200%, and what it will do is it will bend up for me, so it grows above a linear line. And I can control these different pieces of it. So I can set these sort of growth rates. I can have straight growth rates. I can also bend the curve. I can have it growing and then sort of leveling off, or I can have it growing even faster as it goes further out in time. In addition, I also have the ability to set the seasonal indexes. What if I wanted to set this? So I came over here and said, you know what, January, I want the index to be 1.10. So I want it to grow at 10%. And actually, May is a very low period. I want it to be at 0.9, so even less. And I can go ahead and commit this, and what it will do is it will bend the seasonality to my will. So I can actually set the seasonal components. And if I was doing indexes for events, I could also set the indexes for events. So I could set the volume of events for these different things. So how is it that I would actually utilize this information? Okay. There's a bunch of different uses, but we're starting to see with some of our clients some of the big ones. The first is to customize the trend for an individual item, or I could set a specific trend for lots of items. I could also set the seasonal pattern, or I could share these with different folks. So for example, if I came over here, let's look at this item. I could come in here and set a trend. You know what? I don't think this is going to level off. I can come over here and choose my model component. Okay. And I could come over here and say, you know what? I think this should be a trend. I'm going to do a bent trend. I don't think the slope should be 0. I think that this should actually be growing at about 10 units a month. Oops. Let me go over here and say, set this to 10, and we can grow this. Or I can come over here and, so now I'm growing. I can see that this growth is going to continue. Or I could, of course, bend this, and I could set this to say, I think it's going to grow now, but it's not going to keep growing as fast, so I can bend it down this way, and it will bend over time. So I'm growing quickly, and I think I'm going to keep growing, but I can start bending this. So I can set these on individual items. Or if I were to come back to this item here, I can take this and I can say, you know what, I'm going to set this back to automatic, but I'm going to use my custom seasonality. And what this allows me to do is I can take this component model and I can apply it to other items. So for instance, I have this new product. I could come over here and put the same component model on here, and it will force the seasonality. So I could take the seasonality from one item and force it onto another item, whether that's a new product, whether it's an established product, it doesn't matter, but I can share the seasonality from one item to another. And this is a very, very useful feature that comes along for the ride. Okay. Now, the final piece of our modeling is our new product forecasting. We have now expanded our forecasting by analogy usefulness. Okay? We've added new features in the dialog box, and more importantly, we've given you the ability to create schedules from other items. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So here's a sample, and what we have is an established product, and it's actually going to be replaced by this item right here. Okay, this product. So this is our existing item. It's going to be replaced by this. Now in version 3, I could have built an analogy schedule out of its history, out of its forecast, but I'd have to do that by hand, and I'd have to do that in Excel. And so what we've added here in the new version is we've been able to right-click on any item that's in your hierarchy, and we've added this new option that says helper variable create. I can now, instead of doing a helper schedule in Excel, I can now create it dynamically within Forecast Pro itself. So go ahead and click on it, and what it'll do is it'll let me build a schedule out of its history, the history in the forecast, the seasonal indexes, the trend. I can pull this out of any of these different items. So for example, if I were to create this out of the history, I'll call this 10AX hist. What it will do is now here at the bottom of my hierarchy, you'll see it created a helper schedule out of the history. It did it dynamically for me. And if I were to go down back to my new product up here, I can right-click and say Model by Analogy, and I can now use this schedule in a forecasting by analogy and use all of the same features that I had available to me before in version 3, and it will apply this shape to this new product. Now, this brings up, now that we have the component model and the analogy, they do some of things that are very similar to one another. Typically, the way that you would want to think about it is the component would allow me to put a specific component onto a new product. I could do the trend, I could do the seasonal. Where the analogy expands upon that is I can put a specific shape. For instance, I use the history. So when this item is introduced, I think it's going to have a very different pattern than its established seasonal pattern. I can use this by analogy to do that. We've also added some new features to the by analogy box. For instance, this automatically extend option. What this says is, in version 3, if your schedule wasn't long enough to cover the forecast would just drop to 0. And we realized that that wasn't really good. And so now, if your schedule isn't long enough, we actually use expert selection to forecast out to fill in the rest of your schedule. We have this expert selection after. What this is basically an ending date of the analogy. It says that in June of 2016, this product will no longer be new. It'll have enough history that I want to drop the analogy methodology and start using expert selection instead. So I can set a date when it's going to turn off the analogy model and switch back to expert selection. And we've also added this align seasonality option. If you create a schedule out of seasonal indexes, this will make sure that the months line up automatically. And the same thing will be true as if you take a schedule and you want to make sure the months line up, we can use this option as well. So new expanded features in our analogy, not just the ability to create a schedule, but also to come in here and actually go through and expand the new functionality with new product forecasting. Okay, so let me come back to my slides, and we've actually covered a lot in this session, and I want to draw some conclusions here. So what did we actually look at today? So we talked about upgrading from version 3 to version 4. Okay, very simple, straightforward process. All we have to do is open our project in version 4, and as I recommended, you're going to want to save it with a new name just so you can move forward in time. But that's it. We talked about the data manager and this new sort of one-stop shop for where we can actually see all of both our history and all of our external data files that we can bring in. We looked at improvements in the override grid, our new system rows, where we can show our archived forecasts, which we have available to us, as well as our whole number rounding forecast, which is very, very useful, and especially for low volume data. And then we looked at the new improvements that we've made in modeling. Okay? We've added our component models, which allows us to build individual components of our products. We looked at new product forecasting, and we looked at the constant level and exponential smoothing. So lots and lots of new features we think that will really make your life a lot easier and your forecast more accurate in using version 4. Now, a couple other things, just some housekeeping bits before we finish up here. I do want to point out that we do offer training for Forecast Pro. So if you're upgrading to version 4 and you do want to inquire about training, we still offer that. We can do it via WebEx if you want to do sort of shorter or web-based, or we can do on-site training. We can help you sort of understand the new data, and we can always personalize it. And you can find out more about this at forecastpro.com. And another thing that we're very, very excited about to announce is that in September, we are having our first user conference in several years. We haven't done this live in a few years, but we think that with the growth of TRAC and with this new version 4, it's a great time for us to gather Forecast Pro users to really meet, to network, to interact with each other, and to share sort of best practices of using it. So it will be September 28th through the 30th here in Boston, Massachusetts. Monday the 28th will be an optional pre-conference workshop. Eric Stellwagen, the president of the company, will be giving this and talking about methodologies within Forecast Pro. So it's really more of a forecast methods session. And then Tuesday and Wednesday is the main conference itself. We'll have tutorials and user presentations and demonstrations. In terms of a sampling of some of these things, we'll have a session on unleashing the override grid functionality, a lot of sort of the tips and techniques that we've gathered from users. We'll talk about performance. I know a lot of folks have very high volume, lots and lots of forecasts and large archives, and so how can we improve performance of Forecast Pro? We'll talk about next steps in the development of Forecast Pro, as well as case studies from some of our users, including Caterpillar will be speaking and talking about their global rollout of Forecast Pro. This will be a limited event in that we're limiting it to 60 users. We want this to sort of be a small gathering of Forecast Pro users, so please don't hesitate. Please feel free to order at this point and sign up. You can go to Forecast Pro to see the full schedule of what's going to be offered, as well as to register. So please, I highly encourage you. I think this is going to be a great conference, and we're really excited about it. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up the session. As always, if you need questions directly, please feel free to email me. My email is on the slides here. I'm happy to answer any questions about TRAC version 4 going forward. And we really are excited about it, and I highly encourage everyone to upgrade and to take advantage of all of these new features.